Not yet midday, Benny, so I can ask you about the weather in Stellenbosch.
You don't want to know. It is like last year, April, the most amazing weather every day except Monday. We had a strong southeaster, but otherwise it is windless. The sea is as flat as a pancake, and every night is dry weather.
Well, that's very nice.
Good for the wine industry.
And it also then gives an opportunity that if the meat is red wine orientated, that one can indulge in something that is equivalent to the weather and to the beauty of the Western Cape.
Okay, well, it's a nice day to be talking about old wines.
Absolutely. I've been drinking some 2010s and 2011s in the past month or two, so they're all 10 years or older. And I'm very impressed with our 10-year-old wines. The reds are really showing well. And I had a 10-year-old Chenin Blanc also about a week or two ago, and that was as good and absolutely a delicious wine. We eventually decided not to eat anything with it, just to drink the wine.
Sounds very grown up to me. How are we for time, everyone?
We're going just another minute and then we can start.
Well, I mean, and I will say some of this for the discussion. I've been drinking an enormous number of really old wines, and I think we have a real job ahead of us in terms of telling people what to look for and what to enjoy. You know, I'll talk about it on air, but I mean, I went back nearly 70 years on the weekend. I've gone back nearly 30 years with white South African wines in the last day or two. We have a treasure trove.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Okay. Are we ready to go?
I think we can go.
Okay.
I'm going live with the pictures.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar series, for the Cape Fine and Rare Wine Arts third webinar series. We're going to turn our attention to South Africa's old gems that captured the imagination then, and I guess still now. Michael's just alluded to 70-year-old reds, 30-year-old whites. What are we going to see in these wines? We've got some exceptional grand old ladies at the auction this year, and we're going to talk about them. And they are in fantastic condition, immaculate provenance in our pristine condition. So we definitely want to talk to them. But to no further ado, I want to just welcome Michael and Bennie. This is legendary and knowledgeable South African wine historians and professionals, wine judges. That is definitely, you will look hard to find more knowledge in the room with Bennie and Michael to know about South Africa's old gems. So I would encourage you to ask questions at the bottom of your screen. We will deal with the questions at the end of the discussion, but if there's anything that we sort of feel is topical of exactly what they're talking about, we will interject and discuss that question. But enjoy and please interact and ask as many questions as you like. Thank you very much. The floor is over to you, Bennie and Michael.
Thank you very much, Sinead. Good morning, or rather good afternoon to everybody. And I'm Michael up in Johannesburg. I hope the weather there is going to be as good as our weather, because I think tonight is another dry night in the Cape with some old red wine. I would like to start off by maybe just putting a little bit of perspective on why these old wines at an auction. And if we go back to 1975, which sounds a long time ago, but it was in the midst of the new renaissance of red wines enjoyment in South Africa. The Nederburg auction started as a platform to sell some of our older red wines. Now, the amazing thing is, if you look at the red wines that were on the auction in 1975, they were anything between 5 and 10 years old. I just took a quick list at the list that we have for auction in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and most of these wines are 35, 39, 40, 41 years old. It is quite an amazing thing to see that we have come a long way since 1975, having an auction where we can still find these gems. And Michael will agree with me that I think if we look at the availability still of these wines, I mean, this is absolutely unique for a new world wine country. If we think that, you know, how did these wines come to be stored over the years and are still available in reasonable quantities? So I think we must congratulate the auctions over the years that made it possible for us to still have these wines available for wine lovers, for us to enjoy, and to be able to look back into the history treasure cove of the amazing wines that have been produced in this country. So I hope this webinar will help us to understand a little bit more about the beauty of older red wines.
So if I may come in here, Bennie, it seems to me that we've got a number of issues to discuss. The first is obviously the wines on the auction, the lineup of them, the reputation in terms of the vintages and the producers in question. But I think we have a bigger issue to confront, and that is that we don't, as a current community of wine drinkers, necessarily look to age in wine as a positive attribute. And so I think the first thing that I would like to add to the conversation is that old wines, by their very nature, taste different from young wine. Young wine is all about primary fruit. It's about juiciness. It's about identifiable, in a sense, primary aromatics. So when you get a Pinot Noir, you say black cherry. When you get a Cabernet, you're looking for cassis or black currant. When you get Shiraz, you're looking for raspberry and perhaps white pepper. When you get to old wine, the transformation is to secondary and tertiary characters. And so what happens is you get an earthiness, you get a whiff of undergrowth. The French call it sous-bois, the Italians call it sottobosco. What you're getting is a much more complex, much more nuanced, less obviously primary fruit. And it's a really difficult thing to say or to affirm, but if you're looking for primary fruit, go out and buy a bottle of Ribena or buy a bottle of cranberry juice and drink the juice, because that's what you're getting, is you're getting alcoholic fruit juice. If you're looking for what wine at its very best can deliver, it is that nuanced, slightly mushroomy, slightly forest floor, those interwoven layers of leather and hints of almond, all of the spices that come out through aging. And you see it in the wines that are known to be age-worthy worldwide. So we look here and there are a bunch of Cabernets. And on the weekend, because we were having a bit of a special function, I opened a Cabernet blend from 1952. And it was in perfect condition, and it looked better than the two younger wines, which from 64 and 70. It was just an amazingly intense, very pure, not hard to drink at all. And in fact, sadly, the truth is old wines are easier to drink. So you can drink more of them and feel the effects less. So Cabernet is a classic age-worthy variety. But we see here as well a Cab Shiraz blend. We're looking at ports which age literally for a century. It's a completely different view on wine. I wondered what you thought about that.
You are absolutely right, Michael. What amazes me is if people taste an old red wine the first time, they sort of sit back and say, I didn't expect all these various flavors, because maybe that is one of the amazing things to me, is if you open, like I was very fortunate to be with JP Bailey at the Tabernacle Cellar yesterday, opening this very same Zonnebloem Cab 86. And if you look at the astonishing numbers of aromas that come out of your glass just on the nose, it is not just that cassis that you were referring to. It is now more than that. And it is like in layers that you are smelling through the wine even before you put it in your mouth. And the taste is, to me, sometimes that amazing silkiness that you find in an older wine. The tannin structure is still there to keep it alive, but it is soft tannins. And with that come the development that brings the flavor of the grape now in different layers of flavor. It has now married with the oak that the wine spent in it for time. And you now have really a wine that is multifaceted and multi-layered. And as you say, it drinks so nicely that before you know, a bottle is empty. And that is before you even started decanting the wine. Now, I always say, let the wine grow in your glass if you pour an old wine. And that we have seen also in the past month or two that I've been drinking some older wines. You pour the wine, and 15 minutes later, it is as if the wine is now mushrooming. It is growing even bigger in stature. And you have this expectation of, wow, what am I going to get now if the wine just opens up a little bit after being poured? And I think this is what we need to bring to the table if you taste and drink these old wines that we have on the screen, is they bring to you a new experience of what wine can be.
So, I mean, there are a few comments to pick up from there. The first is that as wines age, you get the impression that the acidity diminishes. In fact, technically it doesn't. The acid has nowhere to go, and so it remains as a preserving factor. But the wines always seem less aggressive. And part of that is that the tannins do settle, and that is what in part creates the sediment in the bottom of old bottles. So one of the reasons we do talk about decanting old wine, otherwise pouring them very carefully, is to settle the sediment at the bottom. There's nothing wrong with the sediment, but it affects the clarity of the wine. And in fact, I grew up in a place where the so-called dregs of the bottle, that last bit of sediment, was for the guest of honor, because although it was murky in the glass, it contained the concentrated flavor and intensity of the wine. So sediment is nothing to be frightened of. It does come in old wine, and it actually should be embraced, and it shouldn't be spread through the bottle. You should, separate the sediment and go from there. So those are important factors. But there is a question that has popped up which deals with storage and cellaring. And that is, and you can't stress that enough. The amazing thing about old wines is how well they've survived despite an era in which the cellaring conditions were less than perfect. So very few wineries and very few home cellars up to the 1990s had proper refrigerated or temperature controlled environments. But I said there we are, I'd had a Bordeaux from 1952, which absolutely had traveled around the globe. It came with, markings from various markets in the world. It was a bottle I'd been tracking down. It had traveled, it couldn't possibly have traveled in refrigerated circumstances all the time. And yet, nearly 70 years later, it was in immaculate condition or in good drinking condition. The real test, of course, is what it would have been like next to a bottle that had never been removed from the winery. And so that situation is different, and it is important. The wines that we are seeing here have all come from the producer's cellars, with the exception of the old Vin de Constance, which we should talk about separately. And so the fact that the wines haven't traveled, the fact that the wines have remained in the producer's cellar, all of these things play a huge difference. In Burgundy in 2009, I had a 1904 Montrachet. Now that's a white wine, 105 years old. It's a Chardonnay, and it was delicious, not just like, you know, kind of a visit to the museum and removing the shroud from an old mummy. It was a bottle of wine. If there'd been a few more, I would have drunk a few more. It was delicious. So good storage is a crucial component to the enjoyment of old wine.
And I think, Michael, what has happened is that because a lot of these old wines, for instance, in the Tabernacle, came from various cellars on the premises of SFW in those days, they were all in reasonable, constant temperature. There wasn't huge fluctuation in temperatures, maybe a bit warmer in summer than one would expect, but we know that the winters in the Cape are cold enough to bring down the temperature reasonably well. But what I have found is that once those wines have gone into the perfect cellaring conditions, like at the Tabernacle or at Nederburg, as you say, since, let's call it, the beginning of the 80s, when refrigeration was more available and controllable as well, those wines have remained, in terms of their taste, almost the same over the past 3-4 decades. And that to me is, I think, part and parcel of the great winemaking that took place in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s. We cannot get away from the fact that although there was not all the knowledge that we have today in terms of winemaking, but those wines were solidly made. They came maybe from vineyards with lesser tonnage, and you would find maybe more concentration in the wines. But I find that the wines from the 60s and the 70s, and we have tasted many of them together over many years at your competition, we've seen that they stay reasonably the same. So that sudden death doesn't happen in these wines. And I think that is also an encouragement for our consumers and for the buyers, that if you buy the 1980 wines, you can still keep them in your cellar for another 5 to 10 years and have the enjoyment of drinking a bottle, you know, whenever the occasion is there to open an old wine.
So, I mean, it's obviously true, and it comes with an interesting thought about the evolution of old wine. And I'm talking at the moment specifically about red and probably Cabernet-based red, is that for the first 10 to 20 years, it's on an upward progression in terms of evolution. And then it reaches a plateau of maturity, depending on the wine, depending on the vintage, depending on the origin, let's say 20 to 25 years from vintage. And a properly made wine from the right site, the right varieties, will then stay on that plateau of maturity for another 30 or 40 years very easily. You know, as I say, there was a 70-year-old bottle on Sunday. There was nearly a 60-year-old bottle the other day. And even white wine, I've just had a 1992 South African Sauvignon Blanc that is still in really enjoyable condition. So they have that age worthiness that takes them up to the plateau and keeps them there. And the length of time that they stay on the plateau is partly a function of storage, partly a function of the variety itself. So we know that Cabernet is long-lived. I've had Cabernet nearly 200 years old. It was fragile by the time I got to it, but certainly it wasn't over the hill. So you're quite right. The wines that are on offer here have been selected with a view to their being, if well stored, capable of at least another 5 to 10 years of aging. I see a question which relates to this, which is about old wines oxidizing, or I presume evolving quicker in glass or decanter. And I think you made the point early on, Bennie, that it's better to bring a wine to its peak in the glass than in the decanter. So if you are going to decant old wine to separate it from the sediment, it's something you do at the very last minute, so that you don't over-oxidize a wine, because you can't bring it back from a place it's gone to. Once it's in the glass, you've got a controlled environment, particularly if it's the right glass and it's got the right amount of bowl. you can then bring it to a point of enjoyment easily enough. But I would certainly not open and decant a 30 or 40-year-old wine in the morning for service in the evening. I see that as too much of a risk in terms of that.
Michael, I was very fortunate yesterday to taste in the Tabernacle this very same Zonneblum Cab 1961. That's 60 years old. Now, what amazed me were two things. One, the color of the wine, the intensity of the wine, of which I would describe as still a dark red with that touch of onion skin, and followed by the intensity of cab flavor. And what makes me so happy about South African cabs is that the richness of the cab flavor changes from that initial, let's call it young fruit that you get from Cabernet. And this became now round and sweetish, but a brilliant sweetish, a fruit base at the bottom of the fruit, but it filled the mouth. And I just said to myself, gosh, 60 years and the wine still has fruit that presents itself in the glass, not only on the nose, but also on the palate, and no jamminess and no oxidation. You know, one really wants to go on your knees and say, gosh, can I just salute this wine because it is so great. So for those who are thinking, is a 60-year-old wine worth buying? From my experience yesterday, I would say any day and any moment. And please invite me if you buy the wine and you open the bottle, because it is such a pleasure.
So there is a sentimental value to drinking old wine. And obviously sentimental value shouldn't exceed the qualitative thing. But when you drink a wine like that 61 Zonneblum, you're drinking a wine made by somebody long dead in all likelihood. You're drinking a wine that dates to another era. You are, in a sense, participating with all your five senses in some connection to ancient history. And it is a remarkable thing about old South African wine. You know, at the old wine tasting in 2011 at the Trophy Wine Show, one of the overseas judges was Neil Martin, who at that stage was writing for the Wine Advocate. He's now moved on to Venice. So he was Robert Parker's man. It was his first trip to South Africa. And one of the wines at the end of that tasting was the 61 Lanzerac Pinotage. And when Neil tasted it, he said it transformed his view of South Africa as a wine producing country. He said there was a wine, it was 50 years old, made in the same great 61 vintage that had redefined Bordeaux. And he said it would stand against the best of Bordeaux of the same vintage. He said, I could no longer think of South Africa as a new world wine producer, because here I had a wine in my glass that spoke about the antiquity of our wine traditions. So I think that's a very important point, and we should never forget that connection. The other interesting thing about wines of that antiquity, and here I'm quoting the late Ronnie Milk, is he said it was before an era in which producers got greedy. So the production volumes were very small. The ability to select the best vineyards was there. They would all have been bush vine or maybe single wire. There was no attempt to bump up the production. So the concentration of fruit was completely remarkable. And there is a question which has to do with how can you assess the quality of the wines without opening them? And there are two answers to that question. The one is that if we could taste the bottle before we opened it, we'd be very happy human beings. The Irish say that's the only way to drink Clos Vougeot, is you have to taste it first. But there are guidelines, which is your question. The one is ullage, that is the difference between the level of the wine in the bottle and the cork. So if you look at the image of that 61 Zonneblum, That's completely extraordinary for a 60-year-old wine. That's a very good full height. If you look to the 1980, which is to the left of it, that's a perfectly acceptable full height for a wine that is over 40 years old. When the wines come in claret bottles, that's like the Chateau Lib, you certainly don't want it much below the top, the bottom of the neck, the top of the shoulder. And yet they do survive. The one wine I had on the weekend had an ullage to mid-shoulder and it was still fine, but it was tasting aged. So the higher the full height, the more certainty you have that that wine is likely to not only have aged well, but to continue to age well.
Michael, I think the proof of the pudding lies in the drinking. And I have never been scared to open an old bottle of wine because the anticipation in what you may find once you pull that cork, and even if the cork is a little brittle at the bottom and there might be a small piece that break off when you pull the cork slowly and gently out, to me, the surprise to open the wine is just enough to say, don't wait too long to open the wine, because it's better to drink it when it is now ready and you have the occasion. And I sometimes think that the emotion around any occasion will even heighten the pleasure of drinking the wine. Like that wine that we might have to end off with, because I think the time is running out, that 1821 Grand Constance. I was so privileged to open a bottle like that with Dani de Wet at de Wetshof, together with a group of Cape Wine Masters in 2004. Now, I can remember every moment of opening that wine. And that's why I say about the emotion of it. But what a treasure we have in South Africa, that we can still boast wines that were made 200 years ago and more, 1791 Grand Constance. There's no other New World country that can say that we have wines that are still in the bottle like this. And you have personally also had the pleasure of drinking this Grand Constance. What do you say about that if somebody wants to buy that single bottle that's on the auction this year?
Okay, so that is in fact one wine that does come with a very special kind of guarantee. So I've been lucky enough to have had several bottles, more than I'm going to confess to, of the old Constantias, the 1791, the 1809, and even one or two of the 1821, and have never been disappointed with wines of proven provenance. That's the first point. The second point is I do think the wine is immortal. The one bottle I had ullaged below that very long neck. And when we got to taste it, the wax seal was the only thing keeping the cork in the bottle. The cork had shrunk, so there was air all around the cork. And as we lifted the wax, the cork simply came out. And yet the wine was absolutely stable. And there's been quite a lot of research done about the century-old Para ports. And one of the things we know is that wines of the style, if made properly, literally do become immortal. They don't transform in any way beyond 50 or 100 years. So that's a crucial thing. But the final, with an eye on the clock, point about this wine is that it was recorked whenever it was last year.
2019.
And 2020, nothing happened in 2019. And I had the privilege of being part of the recorking team. And although we didn't steal any wine out of the bottle, you'll be pleased to hear, and I'm sad to report, the truth of the matter is that we obviously checked every bottle by way of sniffing it at the neck. And that bottle was in absolutely perfect condition. And so it had survived its first couple of 100 years pretty well. And it now has been resealed. And it's had argon gas added, so there is no oxidation taking place. That is a wine that's good for literally another 100 years, because everything about it was checked at the time of recorking and it's been properly recorked. So the answer is that's a wine that comes with the kind of guarantee that would normally be unimaginable under these circumstances.
I 100% agree with you, Michael. So if anybody has any doubt, the two of us are putting our heads on the block to say, this is an absolute gem. You'll never have an opportunity again to get a South African wine of this age and this quality and this beauty. And I just want to add to you the flavor that you get from just sniffing the wine is that alone is an experience on its own. I remember when we opened it that evening with Dani de Wet and the team, we all kept our glass, and for more than an hour after the last drop was slowly put down your tongue, you could still smell the same intensity of the wine in the glass. And that just shows you the concentration of what is in that bottle. And it's about 375 ml, I would guess, all hand blown bottles still in those days. But to me, that is the phenomena of a good wine. If the glass can still hold the smell for you so many minutes and hours after you've had the last sip. And that brings back to me the memories of what a good wine is all about.
You know, that's absolutely wonderful. I've got a smile on my face, and it's just the passion that comes from the two of you discussing it is just phenomenal. I had the privilege to be on Michael's Academy a couple of months ago, and I think my palate aged 30 years that day, just because of all the wines that we tasted. I'm spoiled for life. So my husband's or my purse is definitely spoiled for life because of that. And my whole perception about older wines changed that day in terms of what it brings to the table. Just the layers, exactly what you were talking about now. It is actually fantastic to see how the wines have come across over the last 40, 50, 60 years. So thank you so much for parting with that knowledge today, and to share that with our buyers and to equip them with making the right choice and making and feeling confident that they can buy a wine like that, and there's still a good a couple of years of life in that, and how pleasurable that wine would be. So thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our webinar today. Michael Fridjhon, Bennie Howard, what a pleasure to have you here with us today. So thanks again. Yeah, so our webinar will be added onto our social platforms if you want to have a look at it again, or if you could not join us today. And then also our auction on the 26th of May. If you haven't registered, please go to capefinerareWine.auction to register as either a private buyer or a company. You don't want to miss out on the gems that we've got on catalogue this year. So thank you very much, and have a fantastic day out from the Cape.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.